Hello, I'm Anawiltus, and I'm going to talk about why I don't think Leighton Flowers is fully cognizant of what exactly Calvinists believe. Now, this may sound like it's something a bit out of my usual zone of conversation, but you know what? It's my channel. I can talk about what I want. So, Leighton Flowers has frequently in the past criticized Calvinism in various different ways. And what is very interesting about it is I saw an interview with him where he was talking about how various Calvinists, including James White, very frequently accuse him of trying to flatten things out. And he then states that this is, in essence, an appeal to mystery. And and then he talks about how and then the example he gives is when a certain Calvinist theologian, I don't remember which one it was, talked about the will of God being a mystery that is something that is unknown. However, of course, the reason why people accuse Leighton Flowers of flattening things out and of not understanding Calvinism is not because he disagrees with the Calvinist categories that the Calvinists make in his apparent lack of distinction between regular Calvinists and hyper Calvinists, but rather because he doesn't seem to acknowledge that the Calvinists themselves make these category distinctions when he talks about Calvinism. He just speaks of it as if all Calvinists are hyper Calvinists. And of course, anyone who is a Calvinist would see that this is, of course, not very not sensible. And you then go on and you find out that Leighton Flowers claims that in the past he had been a Calvinist, which, in light of that, you would assume that when he has a conversation with someone else, he would at least acknowledge that someone has categories uh, and then deny the categories. But instead, he doesn't even acknowledges that people make categories, and just categorically states that it is a mystery or an appeal to mystery when people accuse him of flattening things out. When, in fact, what it is that he is actively, or I don't know if it's even active because I don't really hear him say this, but he doesn't see the categories at all. It's not that he refuses to see them, he just doesn't see them. And so, for example, in this issue, when he talked about the appeal to mystery, what the mystery was that the Reformed theologian was speaking of was not whether free will exists or not, because that person obviously was saying that it exists, and he was also saying that God is sovereign, and that the exact nature of this relationship is not something that is fully revealed. In essence, saying that the Bible says that God is sovereign, but man also has free will. So there's obviously a synthesis of these rather than a contradiction. And therefore, since the synthesis is not fully described, it is unrevealed, and therefore a mystery or subject of speculation, which is not to say that it is unknowable, but rather that there is an aspect in Christian theology that is not fully described in Scripture. And I don't think anyone would deny this, because there's all sorts of questions that people have about what about this, what about that, that you can't really answer from the Bible, and that therefore you have to say is a mystery, because it's not written, and therefore it is a mystery. What also would be a mystery would be God's exact specific intentions for particular actions, since the mind of God is not like our minds, so we can't assume to automatically understand why exactly God does everything beyond what we are told anyway. So, going back onto the idea of compatibilism, what Calvinists do not believe is that God is the puppet master pulling all the strings on not only your actions and your mind. Because what we have to understand is that there is a possibility for God to have created something that we like to call nature, which is essentially anything that, although it may be sustained by God, it is not something that, in essence, requires God to actively work in order to function. And that this is the area in which nature and the natural world exists, and the laws of the physical universe as opposed to the supernatural, as well as free will would be in this area as well, as something that is created and sustained by God, but not something that God actively necessarily operates in, unless there is a particular reason that God does operate there, which is seen actually very frequently in scriptures, such as the hardening of Pharaoh's heart, and there's many other passages. But what Leighton Flowers assumes is that Calvinists have a sort of a hard determinism that God is actively controlling everything, and therefore God is responsible for all things. And he assumes that in part because of the idea that things are predestined. But that, of course, is an interesting question to ask, because let us assume that predestination and free will are not mutually exclusive, because I don't think it is logical to assume that they are mutually exclusive. Because what if God, of course, knowing all of his creation, of course, guiding his creation toward a definite and particular end, chooses to allow freedom in his creation for individuals to accomplish tasks that do not necessarily involve God's active work directly. In other words, it is, for example, the punishment of ancient Israel when they were conquered by the Babylonians was in part the free will of the Babylonians. And if you look at the political history and exactly what was going on, then you see that they obviously had their reasons for attacking where they did and conquering various places. But at the same time, it is the will of God in God's punishment of Israel that he had prophesied beforehand. So, and not just Israel, but the various other nations that were then punished, including Babylon itself in its own turn. But what we see here is that individuals are taking free will actions, and then God also has a bigger plan behind that as well. And this is not something that Arminianists or Arminians, would deny particularly, unless they would deny the whole Old Testament. But because I think an Arminian would be very happy saying that there are people that mean things for evil and that do evil of their own volition, and that then, okay, after having done this evil, uh, they might find out afterwards that God Himself knew that they were going to commit this evil and had already created the universe in the exact particular way that this evil would instead bring about a certain end of good. Uh, and another issue is, of course, the issue of original sin and the sin of Adam himself. And and one might say, why would God why would God allow Adam to sin? Because of course, what Leighton Flowers would have said is that he believes that the Calvinists believe that God made Adam sin, which is not what Calvinists believe. But why did God, knowing the great evil that would come about, give Adam the free will in order for him to be able to sin at some point? Because if we assume that God is capable of turning any evil act into good, and that God has an ultimate purpose in the universe, then we also would have to assume that the original sin itself is serving a greater purpose in God's eyes for an ultimate end. And what greater purpose would this be? And to answer that, of course, we have to say that if we assume that God's purpose in creating the universe is to bring glory to Himself and to, in other words, describe His attributes and the fullness of His attributes, then we have a question to ask. What is presentable about God's mercy and justice and His grace if God would never have an opportunity to present such things? And so we have to go on the idea that God created the universe with the full knowledge that Adam would sin, and with the full intention of taking advantage of that sin to fully glorify Himself and to bring about a perfect world from a corrupt world that arose from an ideal world. And what I mean by that is I'm describing three different points in history here. The ideal world, which is a world where there's no sin, there's no death, and everything is good. But however, it is not perfect, because although everything is good, we do not know the fullness of God's attributes. And then, because of this, when Adam chose to sin, God, already having foreknown that Adam would choose to sin before He even created Adam, God allows Adam to do this. Why? Because it is not only for God's good, but for the good of God's chosen people that He loves to fully understand and to realize the glory of God. So what happens then is we enter into the second phase, which is the corrupt world, the world stained by sin. And of course, Leighton Flowers would probably side on the idea that Martin Luther's idea of the bondage of the will undermines the idea of free will, which is a bit silly in my opinion, because I don't think that your exact nature defines whether your will is free or not, in the sense that human brains operate in a certain way. And to say that human brains, that God created human brains to operate in a certain way, but not in another certain way, would, in my opinion, imply that that you would be saying the same thing, essentially, because it would be like saying free will doesn't exist because of the shape of the human brain. That's essentially what one would have to say for that to be a consistent argument against the idea of the bondage of a will. Because what the bondage of will does not say is that humans do not have free will. What the bondage of a will says is that humans are naturally in bondage to their sin, and that they will freely and happily sin, which of course is unholy and is against the principles of God. And not only that, because it is written in the Bible, it is written, as one should know very well, that there is no one that loves God. There is no one that seeks God. So, and that everyone is sinful. There is no one who is righteous. And you read those statements in the New Testament, and you have to ask yourself, did I become a Christian because I sought God? Did I become a Christian because I was a righteous person? Did I become a Christian because I loved God? The answer is, it's the other way around. The reason why the blind can see the light, and the deaf can now hear the gospel, and the lame can now walk the path of salvation, and the dead are now resurrected and they're alive, is because of the work of Jesus Christ on the cross. And it is that which has given life to people. And because they are now alive, because they are now seeing, and they can hear, and they can walk, and they can talk, they now love God because God has loved them by blessing them and by gracing them with the sacrifice of Jesus Christ, which is this huge thing. But I'm not going to get into that right now. So going back onto the idea of the corrupt world. So this is now a step that now seals God's chosen people. Because before that, there's no sealing because the Holy Spirit didn't come into the world. So, however, they are still predestined, but they then become sealed afterwards because of the order of events in time. Now, at the very end, there's the final judgment, and those who hate God and who continue to hate God because they are unregenerate go to eternal punishment because their crimes and their evil is eternal. The reason why punishment is eternal is not because of the sin necessarily being finite, although theoretically you could still say that. But the reason why it's fully justifiable for it to be eternal, even in the corrupt mindset of fairness that humans have, is that being unregenerate means that you are naturally in opposition to God, and just because you are at the final judgment doesn't mean that you're suddenly going to cease to be in opposition to God. So ultimately, your sin is eternal, and it is free will eternal, too. It is not something that people are being forced to do. These are things that people want to do. And then, therefore, the punishment is eternal. But another way people accuse Leighton Flowers of flattening things out is when he talks about, again, predestination and the time frame of everything. Because you look at what Calvinists generally believe, and that is that God is eternal, not in the sense that God is lives forever, because he is the living God and he does live forever, but in the sense that God is outside of the time stream. God does not necessarily interact with time in the same linear way that humans interact with it. In essence, I've actually have a whole typology on various types of temporal interaction, but I'm not going to get into that right now. It's another video I made way back when. But with this, God is, in theory, interacting with all points in history simultaneously. And that is why things are... not only he is omniscient and omnipresent, but he has accurate knowledge of what we call the future, but what for God is just every time. In essence, that's a bit not the most clear way to say it. That for God is a time. So I guess a good way to look at it is to say, let's say you have a timeline, okay? And normally a human would interact with one point of a timeline at a time, and then that is your existence moving down through the time stream. But then, let's say instead you're looking down at a timeline from outside, and what you can do is you can interact at any point in the timeline simultaneously with any other point in the timeline throughout the whole timeline infinitely. So that's maybe a way to look at it. It's another way to look at it would be the difference between looking at a landscape from the ground and then looking at it on a map. Because on a map, you can see the entirety of the landscape. On the ground, you can only see what is in front of you. But now instead of looking, we're actually doing an interaction. So that's a bit complicated, but that is the general theology proper that many individuals have about how God exists, that God actually created the time stream itself, and that therefore God looks into the future and in the same way that any person would be looking at what's right in front of them. But instead of just the present being in front of you, it's all points in time, and you're interacting with all of them simultaneously, and not in a sequence either. But from the time frame, it would be sequential. But this is the ultimate simultaneity. But anyway, but then here's a question. Does knowing the future, or even revealing the future, or assuming that the future is a particular future, render things as being deterministic? Because this is actually a way that people interact with each other. Uh, as in, people assume that certain future events are determined, and that your free will, although it may have an effect on how things happen along the way, will not change a particular eventuality. This is an assumption. And this is not a theological assumption. This is a very physical assumption. And this assumption would be, for example, let's say I have a ball, and I'm throwing a ball at someone, and that person sees the ball coming. Does that person now assume, not assume, that the ball will continue to move now that it has been thrown, and that there is an eventuality of the ball moving in a certain direction? Now, then, you look at economics and politics. The very principles involved are assuming that certain actions will lead to particular outcomes, and that although the free will of the individuals initiating the actions will affect the outcomes, that theoretically the general outcome will not be changed by a minor interaction that someone else has in between. But to be more, but of course this is all anthropomorphizing all of this, because these are not exact comparisons. But now let's look at John when he wrote Revelation, and what we see is that John is witnessing the final judgment. And the question then becomes, if John, or if the information that John received is information from the final judgment, does that not assume that some individuals, or whoever is at least being judged at the particular moment that this information is being given, does that not assume that that is predetermined already, in the sense that these are events that will happen because God has prophesied that they will happen, and that whoever is judged in a particular way on the final judgment will be judged on that particular way on that day, when that day finally comes, even though it hasn't come yet? Does that not assume that? Because if it does, then the predestination is proven by the fact that there is a definite future. And the assumption that we should make is not that we are incapable of using our free will in order to affect the universe around us because we are afraid that things won't change. The assumption that we should make is that whatever we do, whatever choices we make, those choices inevitably lead down the path that God has laid out. And that there's this, in essence, a sort of a harmony that God, of course, has supernaturally acted and has caused particular events to particularly take place. But at the same time, in the natural actions that people take, it also plays into God's grand plan. And this reliability of God's predictions of the future is a major cornerstone in the Christian faith. And when I say the faith, I'm not talking about the religion, I'm talking about the faith itself. The trust that we have in God. The trust that God is capable of accomplishing what he has set out to accomplish. The trust that God's words are true and that no one can change them. The trust that God's power and its exercise is true and that he cannot be defeated. Why do we know that God cannot be defeated? Because he will not be defeated. And we know all these things because they have been spoken to us by God himself through the mouths of various prophets. So we take that to mind, and then we have someone saying, well, God, did God know that, and I'm not necessarily talking about Leighton Flowers, I'm talking about various other people, including various open theists. Did God know that Adam was going to sin? The answer is yes, God did know Adam was going to sin. And it is indeed part of God's plan that Adam sins, not in the sense that God is making Adam sin, or in the sense that God is taking personal enjoyment from the fact that Adam does something that is very disrespectful to him. That is not something that God takes personal enjoyment in. A similar thing would be that you have a parent, okay, and this parent sees you and knows that you're going to be making a bad choice. And the parent tells you not to do the bad thing. So now you have the knowledge and you have the intention. You have the knowledge that what you're going to do is bad, but you have the intention that you're going to do it anyway. So you do the bad thing, but ultimately, even though it displeases the parent knew that you could have done the bad thing, and the parent could have taken extreme measures to prevent you from doing the bad thing, but the parent let you do it anyway. Why? The answer is because it is something from which you learn. Because the same thing, we learn about God from the bad things that we have done, and how God has taken all this evil in the world and he has now put it to use for good. So to then say that God doesn't know things that are going to happen in the future and then assume that the prophecies that God made were true makes you ask a question. Do you even believe in free will? Because if we assume that people can act in a manner that is unpredictable to God, and that then God has a particular plan for the future, aren't you saying that at certain points in history, God has no choice but to actively take control of a situation and force thousands, if not millions of people to do particular things in order to get the train back on track? Because that's essentially what would have to happen if God doesn't know the future and still tries to make prophecies. What you have is that there's a train, and God has particular stations for the trains to stop at, but he's not in charge of building all the rails. So when the rails start moving in the wrong direction, he has to take charge and then personally build all the rails, instead of assuming that the rails will be placed in a manner that eventually reaches all the stations. And this manner in particular is something that God knew all the free will of every person. God knows this. And if you know what every person is doing or would do theoretically, then wouldn't you be able to put a plan together that takes that into account? Now, what I'm not saying is that people have a complete autonomy and that God can't, if he could, take over of people. What I'm saying is that God, of course, could do anything. So, for example, God could have prevented Adam from sinning. God could have prevented Satan from defying him. God could have he could have prevented every single murder, every single rape, every single abortion. But what happens instead is that God lets people fill up their iniquity, and then he punishes them for the evil that they have done. And from that we know God's justice. And that then some of those individuals, God chooses to give grace to, and has Jesus Christ himself dies. He dies for those people. And when he dies, he has his righteousness is put on those people, and their sin is put onto him. Now, of course, Arminians don't believe that. Well, not exactly. They would believe, because believing that would have to would ultimately be the only logical way to assume a double imputation is if you believe in particular redemption, or as Tulip puts it, limited atonement. Because if you don't, then you have a situation where Jesus Christ is not putting the sin on himself, but he's waiting for other people to put the sin on himself so that they can then take the righteousness. And that is essentially a works salvation, if that's how it works. Because a way to put it would be you're going to a buffet, and you can choose whether or not you're going to pick up food and eat it. And is that not a work? It is a work. Because isn't that the same thing that people do with baptismal regeneration, where they believe that, well, it is something that God is giving you. God is giving you regeneration, but all you have to do is take it. And how do you take it? You get baptized. and so there you go. But anyway, Leighton Flowers is flattening things out, not because he refuses to limit himself to what the Bible says, but rather because he completely refuses to look at the categories and the statements that real Calvinists are making. And for this reason, people like James White always, whenever Leighton Flowers comes up, they always mention these things, and then Leighton Flowers, he continues to talk as if he hasn't heard a single word they've said. And there you go. So anyway, thank you all for watching. Tell me what you thought. Was it good? Was it bad? Did I go off the reservation on something? Because I want to be accurate, okay? Maybe Leighton Flowers has said different things, and I don't want to be particularly uncharitable to him, because he is another person who is trying to spread the gospel, and so I don't necessarily want to be very mean to him. So also, anyone out there, don't harass Leighton Flowers or anyone else. That's not a civil thing to do. If you want to harass someone, harass me. No, don't harass me either. That wouldn't be very fun either. But anyway, thank you all for watching, and I will be seeing you all next time on Awiltus. Over and out.